seminars and workshop as part of an ongoing series of how the UK economy can reach net zero. People are joining, so people may think I'm padding, but it's just to make sure people have time to join when they're getting probably their lunch to join the seminar. But today we're going to have 3 speakers, including myself. So I'll be chairing. Just to let you know, we'll have talks covering how agriculture can achieve net zero. We're aiming to do this seminar as a trio, where we'll go through each of the talks one by one, ask key questions associated with each of the talks, because one of our speakers will have to dip off just before we propose to close. We expect this will go much longer than 2:30, so somewhere between an hour and a half long. And if we will have some time, hoping there's time for sort of general wrap-up questions at the end. So I don't know if I've padded enough. I can see there's about a dozen people in the room. If everyone is okay. And yes, thank you, Jennifer. Just to let you know, this is going to be recorded. You probably have all clicked on the button to say so. Please note that any sort of comments that are made, both from the speakers and the audience, will be recorded and available afterwards. So just ticking off all that information. Please keep your cameras and mics off, apart from if you're speaking, Richard. That would be great, and we will get to going. So the first person to speak this afternoon is Professor Richard Dewhurst. Richard is just back off annual leave, so go easy on him a bit, and faced this today. But more importantly, he is head of our Dairy Research and Innovation Centre, but particularly relevant for today is also co-chair of the Livestock Research Group for the Global Research Alliance, which is a global alliance helping to identify real solutions around the globe for the reduction of greenhouse gases from the wide range of land use. So with that, I shall hand over to Richard to go through his talk.
Great, thank you very much, Eileen. Can everybody hear me okay and see my slides?
I can see them, go ahead.
Great, that's great, thanks very much. Well, thanks for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. There's really 2 things I want to do in this presentation. One is to talk a little bit about methane, ruminant methane, its position in the greenhouse gas story, and the broad overview of some of the work on mitigation around methane. And then secondly, to talk about the role of global networks in greenhouse gas mitigation. Greenhouse gases don't know national boundaries. This is a global emergency issue. And so we need to take a global approach to it. So I want to tell you a little bit about the Global Research Alliance that I'm very much involved in, and where I think there are opportunities for other people to get involved. So really, this is an outline of where we're going in the talk. A little bit about methane contributions and sources. Then tell you something of SRUC's work on diets and additives and system effects on methane emissions, but just at a kind of high level to illustrate the challenges really. And then finally to talk about international cooperation and the Global Research Alliance. As Eileen mentioned, I'm just back from my annual leave, and I had in my head I was going to update this slide. It's 2017 figures, and there are more recent figures, but the story is relatively unchanged. This shows the distribution of greenhouse gases for Scotland by gas. So carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and the fluorinated gases. And in 2017, methane was 15.8% of total greenhouse gas emissions. So carbon dioxide, a much greater proportion of total greenhouse gas emissions, but methane in second place. If you think about where that methane is coming from, and again, apologies, these are a couple of years out of date figures, but relatively little change. The methane is coming predominantly from agriculture, and within that, predominantly from ruminant livestock. So for Scotland, agricultural methane is 10.6% of total greenhouse gas emissions. In my career, I've worked previously, prior to working in Scotland, I was working in Ireland, and before that, I was working in New Zealand. And those are probably the three countries that, in decreasing order of methane being a major issue in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. New Zealand, with a very large number of ruminants relative to the population and the amount of industry, methane is number one. Ireland is probably next in line, and Scotland is fairly similar. So agricultural methane makes up a significant part of the total greenhouse gas emissions. I'm noticing that there are people in the waiting room. Is somebody letting them in? So then if we think about reductions in methane emissions over the period 1990 to 2017 from those different sectors, waste management has had a reduction in emissions of 74%, and that's mostly been due to landfill gas capture and using those emissions for energy generation. Agriculture, in contrast, has only had a 16% reduction, and part of that reduction has been due to a fall in livestock numbers. Energy supply has had an 80% reduction over that period, largely due to a reduction in coal mining. So you can see that agriculture has some challenges in that its ability to reduce emissions have been relatively low in contrast to some other sectors, and its proportion, although total emissions may be reducing, the proportion from agriculture and proportion from livestock is tending to increase. Thinking then about what are the main factors that drive methane emissions, and there are a couple of things here that are challenging for livestock agriculture generally, but particularly for Scottish livestock agriculture. And the first overarching observation is that feed intake is a dominant factor for driving methane emissions. The more animals you have and the more feed that those animals are consuming, the more methane is going to be produced. So you see here the generally significant positive relationship between the feed intake, dry matter intake, and methane emissions in grams per day. Some variation about that relationship, but there's an almost inevitability about the more feed that goes down the throats of ruminants, the more methane emissions we're going to have. And the other factor that is important in terms of diet effects on methane is at the high level, whether the feed is of a forage base or a concentrate base. We get more methane per kilogram of dry matter intake with fiber-rich diets. Diets such as grass and hay and straw and silage generate more methane per kilogram of dry matter intake. And that relates to the stoichiometry of fermentation and the production of methane. Fiber fermentation leads to more production of acetic acid during the rumen fermentation, which is associated with an excess of hydrogen. And the way the rumen microbial community deals with that is to convert more of that hydrogen into methane. An example from Caroline Duthie's work, I see Caroline is on the call, with finishing steers, fed either a mixed diet of forage and concentrates or what we would call a barley beef type of diet with a high level of concentrates and just a small amount of forage or straw in the diet. the high concentrate diet, resulting in lower methane emissions per kilogram of dry matter intake. So this is a bit of a challenge for Scottish ruminant agriculture, which tends to emphasize grass and forage-based productions. If we were feeding our animals just on cereals, a lot of starchy type of diets, we would get less methane, but that isn't consistent with the advantages we have in terms of forage production and forage-based ruminant agriculture. So a bit of a challenge there. Just to summarize then some of the work within SRUC on diet effects, starchy diets, or looking at ways of reducing methane emissions. One way then, as shown in the previous slide, was to feed starchy diets. It only really becomes very effective when the rumen pH gets quite low, when you're feeding a very high level of starchy concentrate in the diet. In fact, it's most effective when you're getting to the point where the feeding of starch becomes dangerous for the health of the animal. If you feed too much starch to an animal without long fiber, you get this condition called acidosis, accumulation of acid in the rumen, and that has a whole host of other negative consequences for the animal's health. So yes, feeding a lot of starch will reduce methane emissions, but it may bring other health consequences for the animal. And as I said already, it's perhaps not the traditional Scottish type of production system that we tend to emphasize, the sort of clean, green, forage-based systems. Another area that colleagues within SRUC have looked at is the use of high levels of dietary oil, vegetable oils, in the diet of cattle. This is feeding things like distillers' grains, again a very traditional Scottish feed that's a byproduct of the distilling industry. When you take the starch out of grains to make alcohol, you're left with a feed that's quite high in protein, which is valuable for ruminants, but it also contains quite high levels. Some of the distillery byproducts contain quite high levels of oils, particularly when you're using maize as the basis for your whiskey production. Another source of high oil diets is to feed rapeseed meal. So when we crush rape seeds to extract rapeseed oil, we can use a solvent, chemical solvant, to extract the oil, and that leaves a product that is very low in oil content, but increasingly there's interest in kind of crushed, cold pressed oils, if you like, and the residue that's left from cold pressing of rapeseed oil, is an oil rich meal. So again, byproducts that contain quite high levels of polyunsaturated fatty acids, quite high levels of oils. The other thing you can do, of course, is just add the oil directly. So deliberately adding things like linseed oil or sunflower oil or rapeseed oil to the diet. And again, a lot of these treatments reduce the emissions of methane. But again, the most substantial effects are when you add too much. If you add too much oil into the diet of a ruminant, you disrupt the rumen, you impair the fermentation, and there's a whole series of other negative effects. Again, you can have negative effects on the health of the animals. You can change the composition of the milk quite dramatically as well. So both of these situations, feeding starchy diets and feeding high oil diets, are only really most effective when you're getting to a situation that you would otherwise advise against, because it could impair the health of the animal or the quality of the product, or both. Again, just summarizing some of the work from SRUC on feed additives. One of the additives that's been looked at is the use of nitrate addition, which is successful in reducing methane emissions, particularly when feeding a mixed diet. So this is deliberately adding a nitrate salt into the diet of the animals. So reduce methane emissions. Two things to note in relation to that. One is that some work in Denmark showed that some of those benefits were negated, at least partially, by an increase in nitrous oxide emissions. We tend to think that denitrification doesn't occur to any great extent in the rumen. It's not really recorded, the process, nor the microbes, nor the genes for denitrification are not usually found in the rumen. But if you start feeding a lot of nitrate in the rumen, then you can get denitrification and production of nitrous oxide, which is another greenhouse gas. And so the benefit of reducing methane emissions is at least partially offset. The other issue with nitrate is that it's potentially toxic. When I worked in New Zealand, a lot of concerns about residual nitrate in grassland causing nitrate toxicity. So you have to be very careful about gradually adapting animals so that they don't succumb to nitrate toxicity. So not really a very safe and viable solution. So I guess I've kind of summarized the results of SRUC work on feeds and feed additives, really to make the point that it's quite difficult to find substantial effects of diets, that those effects are often only substantial when you're in a kind of danger zone for the health of the animals, and that it's really quite a challenging area. And when I go on later to talk about the Global Research Alliance, I think that's one of the attractions there, is the need for people to cooperate and collaborate globally to try and address some of these challenges. Generally, what I've been saying is that the dietary options available to us are pretty limited. There's one potential big hope that's out there at the moment, which is a compound 3-nitrooxypropanol, 3-NOP, which has really been developed from the bottom up, commercially developed feed additive, based on first principles about the mechanisms, the pathways for formation of methane in the rumen, designed a compound, and it's been shown to have sometimes very dramatic reductions in methane emissions, up to 85%, but on average around about 30% reductions in methane emissions. And there's a lot of work ongoing at the moment to understand that variability, and it's also supposed to be under consideration as a feed additive, but that may take some time to work through the European regulatory processes. So apart from this compound, there are a few options that are not really about impairing rumen fermentation. If you feed a diet that messes up the rumen fermentation, then you may well reduce methane emissions, but that's not something you want to do if you want to have a healthy, happy animal that is making effective use of the forages that you're feeding to it. So just this makes a little bit of a link, I think, to some of the things that Eileen will talk about later on. One of the things that we have thought about, in addition to specific dietary adaptations, is to think about the system level effects on methane emissions, given the fact that specifically targeting the rumen fermentation is fraught with difficulties. Can we reduce methane emissions per kilogram of meat or per litre of milk by improving other aspects of the technical efficiency of ruminant production? So improving the health and longevity of animals, improving the fertility, improving the feed conversion efficiency. If we have less animals dying, less animals unproductive because they've been sick, less animals leaving the herd early because they don't get in calf, then that will all improve the amount of product we get relative to the amount of methane and other greenhouse gas emissions. But I think Eileen will talk more on some of those system level effects. So the other topic that I wanted to just introduce quickly was to give you an introduction to the Global Research Alliance. And as I indicated, this is really because these are big global issues where there is a need for collaboration in terms of the design of experiments, the coordination of research projects, the assembling of information. And in the greenhouse gas area, the Global Research Alliance on agricultural greenhouse gases is a grouping that provides that opportunity to collaborate. So the objectives of the Global Research Alliance on agricultural greenhouse gases is to bring countries together to find ways to grow more food without growing greenhouse gas emissions. It's not a major funding body, so when you hear of new organization as a researcher, your first question is, how do I get hold of money from them? But Global Research Alliance is not a major funding body. It does support some activities, particularly around encouraging collaboration and around supporting early career researchers, and particularly early career researchers in low and middle income countries. So it's very, very strong on helping develop capability and capacity in Africa and in parts of Asia. GRA has 64 member countries, and its council is usually made up by representatives from the ministries. And in the case of the UK, it's DEFRA that are the official national member. The GRA has 4 different research groups, one concerned with livestock, one concerned with paddy rice, one concerned with croplands, and a relatively new research group, an integrative research group that recognizes that very often you need to take an integrated approach across crops and livestock and other land uses and bring that together to find an appropriate solution. So as an animal scientist, I'm most interested in the livestock research group and co-chair the livestock research group, along with representatives from New Zealand and from Ireland. John Tanner has just taken on a co-chair role, and Sinead Waters from Ireland has been a co-chair for a while. So there's a link there to the website for the Global Research Alliance. The Livestock Research Group covers the breadth of livestock-related emissions in 5 networks. So there are 5 networks which are really the nuts and bolts of the Global Research Alliance, what makes it work. So there's a network on animal selection, genetics, and genomics. So trying to breed low-emitting animals and understand everything associated with that. A network on feed and nutrition. So some of the things that I was talking about in relation to diet and feed additives would come under that group. Group on rumen microbial genomics. So obviously the fermentation in the rumen that produces the hydrogen, and then the activity of the methanogenic archaea to produce methane in the rumen is the central focus of that group. A more recent group has been focusing on animal health and greenhouse gas emissions. I guess more of an emphasis on developed country and intensive production, production diseases of dairy cattle, but keen to start to look at more developing country disease issues where that's an enormous influence on emissions intensity. So looking at the disease incidences and treatment consequences for greenhouse gas emissions intensity. And lastly, a manure management group. So the whole question around management of manures and interactions with fertilizer use and particularly nitrous oxide emissions. Manure management group led from China. Next couple of slides, I just wanted to give you kind of examples of the sorts of activities that those networks are involved in, just to give you a feel for the kind of things they do and how you could get involved in it, and how this global coordination works at different levels. And for different networks, it's quite different activities. The animal selection, genetics, and genomics network is running an enteric fermentation flagship. So that the GRA has flagship projects where it tries to bring together national funding agencies to fund coordinated, collaborative international projects. These need to be accessible to a wide range of companies, so to a wide range of countries. The enteric fermentation flagship is looking at the analysis of bovine microbiomes, where there are already measurements of greenhouse gas emissions, feed intake, and feed efficiency. And this kind of work builds on a previous really successful GRA project, which was called the Hungate 1000 project, which was looking to sequence the genomes of 1,000 different rumen microbial species. They didn't quite get to 1,000, but really a lot of the basis of work in that microbial genomics area for the rumen is based on that GRA project, sequencing lots and lots of rumen microbes. Just to put a little flag out at the moment, there's currently a call going through all of these different networks, asking for proposals for future flagship projects. So although I said it wasn't a funding agency, it is trying to assemble ideas for projects, and then we'll work with national governments, funding agencies, to try to promote those as ideas to get funded. Key thing about these flagship projects is they must be globally accessible. The Hungate 1000 project, for example, sequenced microbial communities from sequenced microbes in samples from all around the world. So countries were able to participate by supplying samples that were analysed in a central lab. Review papers is another major activity of the Global Research Alliance, obviously taking stock of where we're at in different areas. And that's one of the things that the Animal Health Network has done recently, looking at what's been published on the relationship between dairy cow health and greenhouse gas emissions. Another activity that the Rumen Microbial Genomics Network gets involved in quite successfully has been in collaborative research projects. So, I mean, the networks work well if you can pull together a project idea and then work together to get it funded. And there are several projects in the rumen microbiome area, Rumen Predict, Master, and a new one that's about to start in October called Hollow Ruminant, that have really been helped along the way by the GRA network working in this area. The Feed and Nutrition Network is, I started out my talk by looking at diet and diet additive effects on methane emissions and explaining that there were lots of challenges with that. One of the things that the Feed and Nutrition Network has been doing is developing global databases of enteric methane and relating that to diet composition. That has been done for beef cattle, and it's been done for dairy cattle. It's been done for methane, and there's also some work on nitrous oxide as well. And those are all being captured in large databases. And there are some major review papers that have just been published for both dairy and beef. So incorporating as much of the global information about diet and methane emissions as is possible to try to extract the most benefit from it. Similarly, in the manure management area, that has really focused around, well, one of the main areas of focus has been around data management, and that they've had a flagship project called DataMan that has been looking at emission factors from manure, from studies with manure collected in 25 different countries. So trying to consolidate based on participation from lots of countries. Okay, that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. I've just typed in there if there's any questions. Please type them. We can do hands up, but that means I'm keeping track of two things. Richard, we have had one during your talk from Derek K. Whilst higher forage-based diets give more methane, what about overall carbon footprint impact? Would carbon sequestration by grassland offset this to any extent?
I'm no expert on carbon sequestration, but I think that's pretty much a live question. I think in some situations grassland will be, sequestering a lot of carbon. In other situations it won't, and I don't think we understand fully where that applies. But yes, I mean, I think the broader principle is we do need to look at the whole system. That study looking at just at the diet, a high forage diet and a high concentrate diet, if you like. There are questions about the production of those feeds, and and the soil carbon sequestration side of things, but equally questions about the embedded carbon footprint of feeds if they have to be imported. So though we're saying that concentrate feeds can give lower methane emissions, there may well be a lot of embedded carbon emissions in terms of growing some of those crops a long way away and shipping them to the UK. So it's there are lots of different dimensions to a lot of these questions.
Okay, I don't think any more have popped in. I'm just checking if anyone has a question and want to put up their hand if they don't want to type it. Can't see that it's coming up. If not, we'll move on to the next speaker, which is me. We just do the embarrassment of trying to share my screen and talk to you at the same time. And like I did for Richard, are you able to see Richard? Just checking.
Yeah, all good.
Thanks, Richard. And yeah, thank you, everyone. So I'm just going to do quite accidentally and share my video. I've been asked to share my video, so I don't know, do I need to start sharing, Jennifer?
Yeah, you can start sharing.
Okay, so do I need to, I'm going to not do later because I'm not showing any video. So data-driven approaches to climate challenges. Myself and Richard and Chris didn't really have time with leave to coordinate, but I think we have quite surreptitiously coordinated quite well on what we're going to cover. I'm going to focus on my area of research interest, which is particularly around livestock genetics, but bringing in how data-driven approaches can help us address both sides of climate challenges. So, we are, focus is very much on net zero, but how does the climate change itself either help or hinder, and it's probably possibly a combination of both, us achieving net zero. So, and how data can help us. So, just want to highlight here, we're talking about how agriculture and land use, and we're probably focusing between the three of us more on agricultural land use in the talks we're presenting today. And what we have seen, and Richard has highlighted, is many agriculture's role in terms of GHG emissions. But actually, since World War II, we've seen a number of key innovation developments that have revolutionized agriculture. So the capacity and propensity of agriculture to both innovate, but also adopt various innovations to grow efficiency of production can be demonstrated through history. And, here are some of the examples in terms of change in the components of agriculture, be it from genetics or nutritional management that Richard has highlighted, the management of the animals, plants themselves, and where can these revolutions help us address these challenges in the future? So do we need more of these variations on these themes or completely new themes? And probably the answer is a bit of all three. So apologies for the graininess. I did try to find a better one of this. A nice clear example going on crops of where genetic tools and techniques have, and the sort of iterations of those have changed dramatically the face of agricultural land use, can be seen in this example in terms of the various genetic innovations in the development of modern corn plants that are grown throughout the world. And we can see prior to World War II, when they were open pollination, relatively little change in the yield per area. So this is bushels per acre. But then as we go in through various plant genetic developments, including the development of single cross hybrids to sort of maximize yield in terms of grain, but also in terms of area, but also in terms of inputs, and various biotechnology techniques, including genetic modification. So we can see, the exploitation of different genetic approaches to keep on that sort of pretty much linear growth since World War II. Similar graphs can be seen for livestock, other crops, but not consistently across all livestock and across all crops. So, plants show it most dramatically, particularly in internationally disseminated and utilized livestock, particularly pigs and poultry. We could see similar types of trends, albeit maybe not as many technologies, particularly the deployment of things like genetic modification, sort of having similar trends. So as Richard has highlighted, that I'm going to try and focus a little bit more on how a systems approach to genetic improvement can help us address some of the GHG emissions that we see from agriculture. The total volumes of particularly methane, Richard highlighted in his talk a little earlier. But in reality, what we've got is a range of fluxes and flows of key greenhouse gas emissions, including carbon dioxide, also methane itself, nitrous oxide, and other pollutants that we can see from ammonia, etc. And particularly the carbon and nitrogen cycle are critical to the efficiency of our agricultural systems and their overall impact on the system. And it's an old slide, but it does what it says in the tin. What we're looking at is how various innovations around genetics as a cow can help achieve those system-wide GHG emissions. So that can be by directly looking at the genetic control or the interaction with the nutrition and genetics of, say, direct impact on methane from the animal, but also by changing some of the efficiency of the animal itself. How does that have impact on the wider system implications and potentially also the wider food chain? And that can include things like the on-farm growth of feed for the animals, the use of byproducts from elsewhere in the food chain, or the, as Richard has highlighted, the international import of feed to meet the demands of the animal according to its genetics. So as much as we'd like to think of these as single innovations, the need to sort of integrate and work across that entire system is really important. I'm going to focus on data-driven approaches, particularly focusing on genetics. I just want to highlight what data currently goes into sort of routine genetic improvement tools in livestock. And these are called estimated breeding values, or EBVs. And these are driven by understanding the genetic relationship between individuals in a population. So that's as represented through the pedigree. So who's related to who and how closely. Information on the animal's own performance for traits that are important. So that tends historically is focused on production, but also wider health, fertility traits and system-wide efficiencies. And to sort of give an indication of what part of that performance is transferred to the next generation, looking at progeny performance data to see the consistency between an animal's own performance and what we can see in the progeny themselves. And obviously those could be across generations or through related animals' performance as well. So that's the simple sort of way how data drives genetic improvement tools. More recently, a number of plant and livestock industries have adopted the use of genomic information to enhance these estimated breeding values. So building on what we can get from pedigree records and actually filling those in terms of far more detail and a little bit more accuracy, but also adding in terms of predicted performance information. So the use of genomics, so looking at individual markers across the genome to sort of map out what, to sort of basically predict what the marker effects for a particular trait might be, but also to identify the relationship between individuals. We can sort of move from the traditional data-driven breeding program, which is limited by time, in terms of how long does it take for animals to become parents of the next generation and for traits to be expressed in those offspring, that you'll be able to use genomic information much earlier on to decide which animals you keep for mating and decide to mate with each other. So this not only does genomic information enhance the accuracy of what you're able to select for, it increases potentially the number of traits you can select for, but it also speeds up the breeding process quite a lot. So, this new approach to integrating this data can sort of help enhance that program. And this is particularly enhanced by being able to look at a wider range of traits with genomics, whereas traditional animal breeding may be really reliant on the regression of that own animal's performance versus the regression of its own performance onto the performance of that of its progeny. That genomic information will help us to potentially not only select more quickly, but select for a wider range of traits with targeted performance, enhanced data recording on a selection of animals that may have the genomic information as well. So I'm going to focus here on some work that we've been doing, working with industry on beef, where actually some of those genetic trends that we may have seen in the corn or in pigs and poultry have not happened as much. So here we've got a range of efficiencies that drive the efficiency of animal production, but also the lifetime efficiency of a system in beef cattle. And that is, as Richard has highlighted, the drivers of feed intake and feed efficiency. Some of that is down to the nutrition examples that Richard has shown, but there is also demonstrable genetic variation in that and how that relates to lifetime efficiency in terms of growing that final product in terms of carcass. But critical to that is the efficiency with which a cow begins its reproductive life and produces calves during her total reproductive life. She does so efficiently without fertility problems, looking at the health and the impact of health of the cow, calf, and the growing animal on the whole system efficiency. So we've been doing a lot of work at trying to drive new genetic and genomic improvement tools across these different pathways, and this sort of highlights the sort of interplay between traits in terms of achieving that efficiency. Why have we focused a lot on maternal and calf traits? Well, actually, it takes a longer time for those traits to be expressed to understand the relationship between an animal's own performance and the regressing that on its own progeny's performance. But also the reward happens over a number of years. So a cow will hopefully have calves around 2 to 3 years for the first time, and then we'll have a number of calves, 6, 7 or 8 over its lifetime. So to see that full expression of that trait in terms of wider system efficiency takes time. So the reward isn't as there as having animals that eat less feed, say produce the same amount of growth rate or carcass weight, where the farmers may achieve that benefit within an animal's own lifetime. Here we're just showing how, from a financial point of view, reducing the age at first calving from where it currently sits at about 33 months. The optimum amount is usually around 2 years, but this is breed and system dependent. So that's not a complete universal truth. And we can see that shifting back from where we currently are to around that optimum would be about £160 benefit. And what does that mean in terms of greenhouse gases? Well, you've got basically a year where the animal is not productive in terms of producing calves, and that's sort of added to the denominator of your footprint of your production system. Just want to highlight, we've been doing some work across the UK, but also particularly in Scotland, to look at age at first calving. Here we're looking at differences between the breeds, and we can see some of those differences largely size related, or what are the main origins of the different breeds in terms of their target, whether their target is for larger animals for carcass versus maternal traits. And we can see the heritability, which is basically a measure of what part of the variation is down to genetic control, is very high for this type of trait, sort of ranges between 20 and 40%. And we can see sort of huge differences of over 2 months between the top and bottom quartiles. So we can see that potentially selecting from the top quartile of animals will help to drag up or drag down, as the case may be, in the favorable direction, age at first calving. So this is driven by sort of vast more data points than has traditionally been used in estimated breeding values in terms of using real world industry data. And what does this mean in terms of if farmers started to use these information to decide which animals they keep to be the parents of the next generation? Well, it will actually result in an annual economic return that will accumulate year on year of nearly £50 per cow calving. So after 5 years, that will be £50 more. In year 6, it will accumulate up to 100, etc. And a cumulative GHG reduction of nearly 100 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per cow calving. So this is achieving that, not only that reduction in age at first calving, but also improvement in longevity in the cows, better calving performance in terms of calf figure and calf health in the first year of life, and therefore calf survival. Don't have a lot of time to go into the detail of all of these, but this is sort of summarizing some of the genetics work we've been doing in SRUC, some of which are kind of oven ready to go and are actually being implemented to a lesser or greater extent in the industry, looking at improving carcass quality, efficiency, that being that sort of right-hand graph of that, we can see that the estimated cumulative effect on profitability is 22% with a 10% reduction in carbon dioxide equivalents, improving the female fertility, that breeding efficiency. In addition to that, increases profitability by 35% and reduction in carbon dioxide equivalents of 18%. Improving feed efficiency, of which there's a range of DEFRA and Scottish Government work ongoing and aiming to produce genetic and genomic evaluations next year. Will, again, this is in cumulative with the earlier lines, increasing profitability, not as much, but actually achieving quite a large additional benefit in CO2 equivalents. Then when we start to go into the addition of genomics, improving accuracy, the turnaround of how we turn around our generations will speed things up. And some of Richard's work that he didn't get around to, but we can, and other work in SRUC about how we can look at matching these data-driven animal-based genetic improvement with genetic improvement that we can see in some of the plants that animals eat, be that grasses or even some of the byproducts, and how we breed plants to meet not only the primary objective of the product, but also its value as a byproduct animal feed, as well as integrating information on what's happening in terms of that rumen bug population too. So these are all kind of highlighting how some of the previous innovations are tools available now, how some of the current innovations we're working on are tools available in the short to near future, and some of the research that we hope to be some of those innovations of the future. Just to sort of go on about some of the animation. So just to highlight, summarize some of these, we can see that integrating these range over the next sort of 10 to 20 years, depending on the scenario we're looking at, particularly across beef, and marrying some of those with what we can see in dairy, has huge potential to increase the benefit for farmers in terms of being more certain on the breeding decision they're making and some of the profitability they will receive over the system, but also reducing the carbon dioxide equivalents and potential in terms of wider land management, releasing some current land for ecosystem services. Just want to highlight some key factors around how climate change itself may be a help or hindrance to some of that genetic potential that we have, as well as some of the wider innovations we may choose to adapt. We know that the climate is changing. Reports last week highlighted it as not some of the trends that we've been trying to push down below 2 degrees we are not achieving, and we are seeing in real terms direct and indirect impact of some of that climate change on some of the extreme events we're seeing locally and globally. We have previously modelled within the UK that actually, from terms of our grassland, something we a lot of the ruminant industries are very keen to promote, the fact that we convert non-human edible energy into edible protein. We do know that under the climate change minus extreme events, that we are expected to have an increased grass production potential in terms of both being able to grow grass for longer and up to potentially 2 months, depending on the system and the area. However, we have got to marry that with the questions that were being asked earlier about what does this mean in terms of the wider GHG balances, either from animals eating grass rather than higher concentrate diets, but also from a sequestration point of view, as well as potential need to sort of manage animals through different disease exposure consequences. The other side of climate change, although we've highlighted a potential positive impact on grass production, is as we particularly get into extreme events, we may see animals moving outside of their thermal neutral zone where they are performing optimally, both from production, but also particularly from a health and fertility point of view. Work built around the Centre for Dairy Research and Innovation, where we have extensively recorded animal performance data over their lifetime, has highlighted that the sort of overall temperature and humidity index, which is the sort of key measure of that thermal neutral zone, shows that animals themselves will vary as temperature and humidity increases, both in terms of being either indoors or outdoors. So that's sort of highlighting the need to sort of manage and consider those interactions. How that relates to overall production, we can see in these lower series of graphs that actually as animals get warmer, that their intake is compromised, and therefore their milk yield falls in that right-hand side graph. Now this is within a particular point of time. In theory, this looks like better feed efficiency, but that has to be balanced over the potential ability of animals to recover from a period of sort of depressed intake, them almost sort of slowing down production to deal with that, and how long does it take to recover. So it's important for us that we're mapping out these potential genetic changes at an efficiency level. What does this mean about the ability of our animals to perform within current and also future production systems? If we map this out in terms of what does this mean? So when we sort of model this across the whole of UK agriculture, we can see that for dairy cows, that heat stress is going to have a net negative impact on overall production, with a 10% decline in fertility and a 0.3% increase in the mortality of young animals. This, by the 2080s, this is estimated to have a net present value of about 80 million per annum. That seems like a big number, but across an industry that actually might be copable. What's really critical to this is if we look at an additional cost of a heat wave, which these are the extreme events we are seeing more of, that will be an additional potentially over 15 million pounds per event, which will compound and go up basically exponentially based on the intensity and the duration of the event, with sort of what larger number of animals potentially lost as they extend in severity. So not only is this a monetary cost to the industry, the sort of additional wastage that this would introduce to the system would increase also our carbon dioxide, the sort of footprint of our production system. It seems small by only 1%, but as we're trying to achieve net zero, it is important that we sort of marry these two together. It's a very busy slide. Just really keen to highlight that there is genetic control for both the efficiency of which we produce our livestock as animals and how they perform in systems. And it's really critical that we sort of marry that with the other side of the climate change coin in terms of resilience. These tools, as we've highlighted, are available, but requires uptake, and that leads to sort of marry what might be obvious in the short term, which might be thinking about producing more from less, versus the long-term biological driver of system efficiency under a changing climate. And just want to highlight that, particularly in line with the series today, that a number of these are iterations of tools that have been available for 50, 60, 70 years or plus, and that how we can drop in new innovations from different technologies to help us drive our goal to net zero. And with that, I shall stop, I believe. I now need to go and figure out, I'm going to stop sharing so I can go back and check the questions. If there are any. I have no questions for me. Is there any hands up there? I can look. If not, I'm fine to pass it over to Chris. Myself and Chris will stay on for the end for any sort of co-questions as well, before we hopefully will close to 2:30 as possible. So Chris, are you able to share? I will unmute.
Okay, can you see that, Eileen?
I can. It's not in share mode, slide. Perfect. That's the word. Thanks,
Should
Chris.
be in thingy mode by now.
Presentation mode. Why could I not think? Over to you, Chris.
Okay, thanks, Eileen. Well, I'm going to talk about how important it is to think about systems in terms of reaching net zero when we think about land management, really. There are an absolute sort of plethora of pieces of information about delivering on net zero at the moment. There's one from the World Wildlife Fund, Worldwide Fund for Nature. There's one from the NFU. There's the Route 2050 from Scottish Land and Estates, touches on net zero. There's lots and lots of good stuff out there. Choose what you like, read what you like, and there's bits of interest in it to all of us. But I just want to sort of highlight what is in fact a poster on the left-hand side of the screen. It's a little bit old, but it makes some really important points. And basically, this is it's a map of the UK. The darker the colour, the more the carbon content of our soil. So Scotland's soils have got more than half of the UK's soil carbon. But I think what's a really kind of interesting kind of geeky fact is that that our soils hold 60 times more carbon than is in all of our vegetation, which is a pretty amazing sort of fact. And losing a very small amount of it would have a very big effect on our greenhouse gas emissions. So some of what I'm going to talk about is about how about that link between agriculture and land management and what happens in our soils. So I'm going to do 3 things. Talk a little bit about making production systems more efficient with some examples around storing carbon on farmland, and then just at the end, some wider things about strategic land use decisions and going a little bit beyond agriculture. If you imagine managing a field, and this is just a field of potatoes up on the Moray coast, all the things that have a pink line around them are things that you can control. Some of them seem like very simple things to decide. Many of them have an implication for energy use and therefore for carbon use. And many of them feel like they're decisions you might make at the level of the field, but actually they might be changed by the way in which the whole farm is managed or the way in which the landscape is managed. And all those things, all the things in the pink blobs affect all the things in the kind of yellowy blobs about soil fertility and soil structure and soil organic matter. So you can make decisions at the field level, but they might be affected by farm level decisions. So if the farm is organic or has a particular interest in low input or regen, then those kind of decisions might be influenced by that. And then, at the landscape level, what's going on, and that might be about managing non-farmland areas like hedgerows and trees and forests. And there's also, quite a bit of work which shows the impact of the landscape on what you do on the farm and the impact of the farm on what you do in the landscape. So if you make your farm very biodiverse, if it's within an existing very biodiverse landscape, you might have very little impact. If, however, you're in a very uniform landscape, making one farm very biodiverse can really change things. So there are several levels of scale that actually influence the impact of the management decisions. And if we think about how we might make production systems more efficient, and back in 2015, WWII et al. Reckoned that somewhere close to 50% of applied nitrogen and nitrogen that's biologically fixed by crops actually ends up as food and feed in Europe. So half of it is going somewhere else. And this is your classic kind of leaky pipeline type of diagram. This one happens to show crop production in the left half of the diagram, inputs being converted into outputs, and then you see losses to the atmosphere, losses to watercourses, mostly associated in this case with nitrogen. And similarly from the animal side, you see inputs from outside of the farm, inputs from any crop production on the farm, and conversion into outputs. So that whole concept that any way in which we can block any of those holes will start to make a more efficient conversion of inputs into outputs. And precision agriculture is one way of thinking about how we make those changes. So this is a map of a field showing a grid sampling with soil pH. And you see here a variation of something like 5.5 up to 6.7, so slightly acid to close to neutral. And that means that you can apply lime, the same would apply to any nutrient you mapped, to a specific area, and you're not putting on large blanket applications of chemicals you don't need, you're not using energy and power that you don't need. And it's important because of the impact that things like soil pH will have on crop yield. So our long-term experiments showing here the impact of soil pH on yield, you can see how differently different crops would respond to pH. And again, you begin through precision farming to be able to very accurately control the pH in the field to get to the right level for the right crop. So barley, really not very happy at a low pH, quite happy at a high pH. Oats, on the other hand, thrives at 4.5, why it does so well in Scotland, but really doesn't like a high pH. So, you know, you start to be able to tailor the kind of agronomic information we have to the techie stuff in terms of precision management. And that not only applies to the use of liming materials or fertilizer materials, but also to being a sort of precision use of weeders, being able to use lasers to go through a field, identify what's a weed, what's a plant, and get rid of that weed in whatever way, using a herbicide or using mechanical cultivation. So enormous sort of potential of precision agriculture technologies for improving efficiency. What's quite interesting is what's the uptake of those sort of technologies. And this is some data from the Farm Business Survey. So this is for England, showing the change in uptake of precision farming techniques from sort of 2012-13 in red through to 2019-20 in black or very dark brown, not sure what that is. And you see that gradual increase on cereal farms up to, you know, getting close to sort of 50% of farmers using those precision techniques. Whereas if you look at dairying or grazing livestock, a much lower uptake, gradually increasing, but much lower, and similarly low in horticulture. And I could have plotted the same graph for uptake of software for managing fertilizers and soil nutrients, and you see a very similar story. And one of the things that we observe through the advisory service that SRUC are involved in is that grassland farmers tend to use soil analysis a lot less than cereal farmers do. And you know, going back to what Eileen and Richard have talked about, we know that if you improve the grassland management, so that might be getting the pH right, getting the fertilizer right, it wouldn't be that hard to double grassland productivity. If you can double grassland productivity, you could reduce the time to finishing of livestock. You could also perhaps reduce the reliance on imported forms of feed that Richard was talking about. So although I'm talking about soil management here, actually it's got knock-on effects right through the system, right through into livestock and greenhouse gas emissions. Plant breeding, of course, is another interesting question, and again, Eileen's obviously talked about breeding. There is, you know, there are some differences in the ability of different varieties. These are all wheat varieties. Maris Widgeon, a very old one, Isterbrack, a current one, and looking at the efficiency of nitrogen going into the plant and nitrogen coming out of the plant. And obviously that varies depending how much applied nitrogen fertilizer you put on. So where you've got 0 nitrogen fertilizer, this is the plant's ability to use soil nitrogen. And inherently you think, oh, that's a good thing, don't need any nitrogen fertilizer. But actually, it's a complicated story because if you start to mine, you could eventually see a situation where you start to mine nitrogen out of the soils, and you need the nitrogen to keep the carbon in soils. So this is it is a complex story. And over time, at the moment, we're seeing slight increases in yields of barley and wheat without an increase in fertilizer. But there are many things that make up that yield. So there's a lot of potential in plant breeding for improving nitrogen use efficiency and potential fertilizer reductions. But at the moment, no amazing breakthroughs, but that means they're still there to make. Another option would be thinking about how we could diversify crop rotation. So grain legumes, so things like beans and peas, and we've also been growing things like soya and lentils in Scotland with varying degrees of success over the last few years. But what a legume does is that the bacteria in the nodules on the root systems of these plants can take nitrogen from the atmosphere and use it to build the plant up. So they don't require any fertilizer on the crop themselves. And then if you look at the diagram on the right, you can what it does is it shows the yield of wheat after one of these legume crops against the yield of wheat after wheat. And if everything sat on that one-to-one line, the dashed line, then there would be no advantage to having grown the legume crop. But as you see, generally speaking, there is a yield advantage. Most of those points are above that line. And if you calculate that through into what you can do for the crop rotation, then if you grow a grain legume 1 year in 5, and you can't grow them any more frequently because of disease issues at the moment, then you could save on average around 30 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. 1.4% of Scotland's agricultural emissions, if you imagine you grew legumes 1 in 5 on all the arable land. So we're starting to understand the impact of different types of rotation, different types of crops on how we can reduce the carbon footprint. If I move on to talking about storing carbon on farmland, this is what I alluded to earlier, that soil carbon is stabilized when carbon to nitrogen in the soil is approximately 10:1. So if we're going to store more carbon, we have to maintain the ratio. If crop yields increase, crop residues increase, and they add carbon to soil, which is all a good thing. But as in so many things in life, all residues are not equal. And actually it's root-derived inputs, it's root carbon, which contributes more to soil carbon than above ground shoot inputs. And you can see there different root systems. This is wheat. This is a piece of work from a colleague down south, Nick Fradgley, and showing how root systems have changed over time. And there's now interest in can we breed crops for their root systems that will particularly impact on soil carbon. And one of the things we need to think about with soil carbon is we actually need to preserve what we have. We've got a lot of it in Scotland, and in some situations, preservation may be the best thing we can do. Again, soil organic carbon is not the easiest thing to think about, but if you imagine a volume of soil, then there's a potential amount of carbon that you can store in a given volume of soil. And that depends on things like the texture of soil, how much sand and silt and clay is in there, how deep is it, how stony is it. So you've got, if you like, a maximum or a potential. Then you add climate into that equation, and that actually reduces the amount of carbon you can store generally. So you've got a sort of attainable, possible amount of carbon that you can store in soil. And then you actually reduce that again to say, but the actual amount of soil is less than that because of tillage, perhaps because residues are being removed, because of soil erosion. So we're looking at a situation where, as I say, sometimes what we're really interested in is this protecting part, moving from actual to what could be the attainable level of soil carbon. And in an ideal world, we start to increase it. So you're kind of looking at minimum to maximum soil carbon. But of course, all that is going to be influenced by the economics of agriculture and what people are actually able to afford to do and what the prices are for different crops. And of course, the socio-political, and that's where paying for carbon comes into it. Again, coming back to different crop types, there are small changes that can be made in arable crop rotations, which will make big differences. So again, data from Sweden showing that every year you put in a ryegrass cover crop between arable crops, then you can add about a third of a ton of carbon. Other estimates, this is from a meta-analysis from the US, showing that moving from a monoculture to mixed cropping, just putting in one different crop, you can increase soil carbon by 3.5%. Adding a cover crop in over the winter, 8.5%. So you start to see there that you can play around and change crop rotations so they will sequester carbon. Perennial crops, as I'm sure you know, have a massive potential for storage of carbon, but they also might make us think differently about how we manage the land. The bottom two pictures are that's agroforestry at Glensoch, agroforestry with some sheep hiding in the trees there and benefiting from the shade of the trees down at Northwick in Devon. Another alternative for sort of arable agroforestry, you can see the lines of trees, and what they're growing there is sea buckthorn, which is you know, a very valuable commodity. So diversifying the farm to make use of these perennials. Intermediate wheatgrass is something that we're hearing, or perennial wheat is something that we're starting to hear quite a lot about, sometimes known as Kernza, and this is from the Land Institute in Kansas, where somebody's made beer out of these long roots. But you can see there the amount of root material compared to the shoot material. And if you look at the root to shoot ratio of spring wheat's about 0.33, intermediate wheatgrass 2.6. As you can see from the picture, it's very tall and the heads of it are very small. So you might not be thinking of it for grain, but it might work as a forage, or it might work as something that you would have as a buffer strip alongside a river valley, but still be able to use the foliage as forage or as bedding. So there are lots of potential out there for looking at sort of redesigning cropping systems within a landscape context. Of course, reducing soil erosion is really, really important in terms of preserving our carbon, although you can argue that soil erosion moves carbon from one place to another rather than actually depletes it, but in some cases it will deplete it. And what you see in the bottom picture here is the impact of compaction, and when soils are compacted, they tend to get erosion and runoff. You can see here this year's tram lines in a field of barley, and across there, that's compaction from the direction of ploughing in the previous year. So again, the importance of kind of good soil husbandry. Something else which I think we're hearing a lot about at the moment is, can we reintegrate crops and livestock? And we've just heard presentations from Eileen and Richard, both of whom have talked about crops and livestock, but we often think of them quite separately. We're involved in a new big EU project where looking at what are there valuable ways of reintegrating crops and livestock. So this is some experiments looking at the idea of bringing sheep onto a farm that would be all arable. This was March of this year, where you can see that we'd had sheep in grazing winter cereals. We actually left the sheep on some of the plots till, the field was actually black. You began to think, is there any winter barley left? But these were harvested last week, and I haven't seen the numbers, but eyeballing the field, you couldn't see the plots that had been grazed. The barley had recovered. There'd been an early bite for the sheep, and there may be potentially some carbon benefits, which we'll look at. I'm going to end up with just a couple of slides about thinking about strategic land use decisions. So going a bit beyond farming per se, and thinking about the idea of putting the right activity in the right place. Picture here, some of you will no doubt know where that is, on the Casagari, with lots and lots of polytunnels. And inside some of those polytunnels, there are strawberries being grown on pots on top of benches. And that starts to make me think, is that the right place to grow those strawberries? They could be grown perhaps on contaminated land. They could be grown in cities. They don't need to be grown on land which could be used for other things. Those polytunnels are going to heat up that soil. We're going to lose carbon from that system. Are there better decisions we could be making? And, you know, is that a role for the kind of role for vertical farming? What are the values that we want from different kinds of land use? And obviously, if we stopped peat extraction for horticulture, that would be quite a big win in terms of preserving our soil carbon and our peatlands. But from an industry point of view, there are difficulties with the quality of peat substitutes in terms of raising horticultural plants. So we have, you know, when we look at a map of Scotland, we have all the arable around the East Coast because of the climate. But, you know, what decisions could we make? What strategic decisions could we make which would allow us to move towards net zero, to reduce emissions, to store more carbon? I mean, one of the big issues, of course, is urbanisation. The right-hand picture there is building the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route. Enormous amounts of soil moved around, enormous amounts of soil sealed by concrete. Similarly, with you know, new build houses, enormous amounts of agricultural land lost to concrete. But an awful lot of people have got lawns in their gardens, recreational areas where there is enormous potential to store carbon in urban gardens. And that's perhaps something we've not given enough thought to either. Should we, you know, when we're talking to people about horticulture and gardening and the design of urban landscapes and estates, should we be thinking about that from a carbon point of view? So the future is going to be different. I started off talking about the uptake of precision farming techniques. We need to really think about that integration of science and practice to make change happen more effectively. We need to use those participatory approaches. I think we also need sort of collaborative and cooperative approaches across different scales. I mean, I've talked about, you know, the relationship between management practices at the field going up to the farm. We've talked a little bit about the landscape. Richard mentioned imported feed. We need to consider these different scales when we start talking about net zero. You know, the role of technology is absolutely enormous, but there isn't one answer to any of this. There are lots of options for every individual farmer. It will be a consideration of what works best under the climatic conditions and the soil conditions on those farms. So, you know, what works where and how do we help people to work that question out? Thank you. I'm going to shut up now. Eileen, you'll be relieved to know.
Not at all, Chris. There's a couple of questions, some of which are generic, and if people have others, can you please type them? We've got about 5 minutes before we are aiming to wrap up. A question for me, Chris, and this is a livestock person asking a plant and a soils person. With those sort of longer rooting plants, one of the things in my limited expertise around carbon sequestration is the ability to store and lock in the carbon further down in the soil structure. Do those long roots help with that at all?
They do, because roots leak carbon basically. and therefore you get microbial communities and communities of soil animals as well around those roots. And it's those microbial communities that make that move from just adding a piece of organic matter to soil into carbon, which is actually going to be held in the soil matrix, and that's what we want to do. They also provide nice drainage channels and help to structure the soil. So yeah, roots are just great. Not that I'm biased.
No, well, I just did. It's my lack of full understanding, so it's good. Question, I think probably more for general, but I'll allow you as chair. I'm going to give the last words to you on this. Do you think the public money for public goods model will encourage more agricultural key players to engage in sustainable practice to reduce carbon emissions?
Good question. I think there are a lot of key players in agriculture who want to reduce carbon emissions from agriculture for a whole variety of reasons. Public money might tip actually people who weren't so sure it was a good idea. So I think, yeah, I think in general, I would subscribe to the idea that it will encourage the industry and not just the key players, but there are some fantastic examples of people out there doing really, really innovative things and perhaps trying things that researchers wouldn't dare to try. I don't know if you agree with me, Eileen.
I think the key players is important, but as Chris's talk highlights, it's about managing it at the landscape and agreement. So not about, you know, it's not just how a farmer decides to manage his own field, his or her own field, or buffers or field margins, but how they manage the whole farm, how they manage it in that catchment area, but also how it integrates, say, with your urban planning concepts as well. And I suppose it's scaling from an individual action and how you might reward either with a carrot or a stick individual behavioural change into achieving a landscape objective. And I'd be really rich if I could figure out the policy solution against all those levers to move in perfect concert. But there are solutions, I think, would be my thoughts out there, both from an innovation point of view, likely policies that will help, but getting them all to work together to achieve the objective is a sort of modern challenge.
And I think there might be a need for localized policies as well. You know,
localized and flexible as well, changing from year to year, time to time.
Yeah.
And be changing in the short term, but also lasting longer than a parliament. So yeah, not easy, but there are tools. That's a good thing. Okay, I'm just going to check. There's nothing else come up. I'm just going to check the hands up. It's quite bright, which is why I'm shielding my eyes here. I don't think there's any other questions. If not, I particularly want to thank the team behind the scenes for keeping us all on track. And thanks very much to Chris and Richard for talking to us today. And I think this will be available, I'm assuming, through various media. Okay,